In August of 1997, a Second World War fighter began to emerge from a small lake in northwestern Russia. It did not come up as a bare frame or a pile of anonymous wreckage. The number 51 was still visible on the fuselage. Soviet red stars could still be seen. Around the cockpit, the American serial number 4113570 remained readable. Inside were instruments, controls, ammunition boxes, and the remains of the 6 heavy machine guns the aircraft had carried into combat more than half a century earlier. The airplane was a Curtiss P-40E, one of thousands of American fighters sent to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. In Soviet service, it had become White 51. It had been lost in combat in 1942, and for roughly 55 years it had rested beneath the water of Lake Kod Ozero. The condition of the wreck was extraordinary enough to make the recovery look almost simple. It was not. Some parts had survived remarkably well. Others had corroded badly. The aircraft had already been damaged in combat and during its forced landing, and even the act of removing it from the lake would add new damage of its own. What came out of Kod Ozero in 1997 was not an airplane that could be dried, serviced, and flown. It was a wartime wreck whose identity had survived with unusual clarity. The much longer story would be what happened after that, when recovering White 51 became something more ambitious than simply saving a relic. 41-130570 was accepted for U.S. Army service on January 23, 1942, and almost immediately assigned for defense aid. It became part of the enormous movement of American equipment to Allied nations at a time when the Soviet Union was fighting Germany along a front stretching thousands of miles. By the spring of 1942, the P-40 had reached Soviet service on the Karelian front. There it flew with the 20th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment in the far north around Murmansk. Its American serial remained part of its physical identity, but externally it had become a Soviet combat aircraft, marked with red stars and the tactical number 51. The P-40E carried 6 50 caliber machine guns in its wings. In 1942, those guns were part of White 51's fighting equipment. In 1997, their survival inside the recovered wreck would help show how much of the aircraft had remained together beneath the lake. On June 1, 1942, 6 P-40s from the regiment were assigned to escort 4 Tupolev SB bombers on an operation against Petsamo. Among the pilots was Junior Lieutenant A.V. Pshenev, flying White 51. The formation was intercepted by German Bf-109s of 2.JG5. The fighting was costly. Soviet records for the operation list the loss of 4 P-40s and 4 SB bombers. White 51 was one of the fighters that failed to return. Exactly who damaged Pshenev's aircraft cannot be established with certainty. German combat claims exist from the fighting that day, but they do not securely identify the pilot responsible for White 51. What is much clearer is what happened to the P-40 itself. It was hit during the engagement, and evidence found decades later around the engine area was consistent with damage that led to a loss of cooling and overheating. For a liquid-cooled Allison engine, serious loss of coolant could quickly turn a damaged but running fighter into an aircraft that could no longer remain in the air. The surviving evidence does not allow every step of the failure to be reconstructed with certainty, but Pshenev was forced down. Below him was Lake Kod Ozero. White 51 came down on the water hard enough to leave clear physical evidence. When the aircraft was examined after recovery, the spinner was flattened, one propeller blade was broken, and there was damage to the upper fuselage structure, the right wingtip, and the forward part of the aircraft. Those marks allow parts of the landing to be inferred, but not recreated second by second. The important fact is simpler. The impact was violent enough to end the aircraft's service, but survivable for the man inside it. Pshenev got out, reached land, and returned to Soviet lines. White 51 stayed behind. The lake became its storage place, although not a perfect one. Water, sediment, temperature, and the different metals used in the aircraft did not affect every component in the same way. Some aluminium structure and covered surfaces survived surprisingly well. Steel rusted. Magnesium parts, especially around the engine, suffered far more severely. The wreck was being preserved and destroyed at the same time, piece by piece, for the next 55 years. That uneven survival is important, because later photographs can create the impression that the whole fighter was somehow protected equally. It was not. Paint and markings survived in places while adjacent hardware deteriorated. Components buried or shielded by sediment could come through in better condition than exposed parts. The outline of the airplane remained recognizable, but recognition and strength were not the same thing. A wing could still look like a wing while fittings, fasteners, and internal members had spent decades in an environment for which they had never been designed. There was no wartime recovery. Pshenev had survived, and the war continued without White 51. The P-40 became one lost machine among many scattered across the northern front. Its significance would change only much later, when the survival of the actual airframe turned an old loss entry into a recovery project. When recovery work finally took place in 1997, the first surprise was how recognizable the aircraft still was. The Soviet number 51 remained on the fuselage. Red stars were still present. The American serial could still be identified. Areas of the original olive drab and neutral gray finish could still be recognized. The cockpit had not been stripped to an empty shell. Instruments and controls remained. Ammunition boxes were still inside. The 650 caliber guns that had gone to war with the aircraft were still there as well. But preservation varied sharply from one material to another. Steel parts had rusted. Some magnesium components around the engine had deteriorated almost completely. Ammunition that had remained underwater for decades could not simply be removed and placed on a shelf. It had to be made safe. Even within the same airframe, the lake had preserved some surfaces while consuming others. That completeness created its own problems. This was not simply a large metal object that could be pulled from the lake with whatever force was available. It was a fragile structure containing wartime equipment and deteriorated ammunition. Parts that looked solid from the outside could no longer be assumed to have the strength they had possessed in 1942. The recovery therefore happened in stages. Flotation equipment was used to move the P-40 gradually toward shallower water. The goal was to bring the aircraft into a position where weight could be removed and the structure prepared for the next part of the operation. This was slower and less spectacular than simply hauling the fighter vertically out of the lake, but it reduced the number of unknowns. In shallow water, the team could reach more of the structure, remove components deliberately, and prepare the airframe for transport, rather than asking the entire wreck to survive one uncontrolled pull. Once it was in the shallows, major components including the tailplane and fin were removed. Ammunition boxes and selected covers were taken out. The work did not end when the main airframe reached the shore. Recovery personnel went back for pieces that had separated from the aircraft or remained on the lakebed, including the armored windscreen, canopy, and parts from beneath the engine area. The sequence mattered. Every component removed reduced weight or prevented a loose, damaged, or fragile part from being asked to survive the next lift. The airframe that had entered the lake as one complete fighter was now being broken down deliberately so that its surviving pieces could be transported without asking the weakest areas to carry the whole machine. Each removal also revealed more of the aircraft's wartime condition. The project was not only exposing a recognizable P-40 shape, it was bringing individual pieces of the 1942 machine back into reach. Parts that had remained together through the landing and decades underwater were now being separated because that was the safest way to move them. In that sense, recovery required the team to undo the aircraft before restoration could ever begin putting it back together. This dismantling was not evidence that the recovery had gone wrong. It was part of making the airframe movable. A wreck can remain visually complete while losing much of the strength its designers once expected from it. After 5 decades underwater, the question was no longer simply whether the wings, fuselage, and engine were still present. The question was where the aircraft could safely carry its own weight, and where additional support was needed. The engine area was especially important. It had already been damaged in the original landing, and the recovery team had to support the front of the aircraft as the P-40 was prepared to leave the lake. Then came the most dramatic stage of the operation. A Kamov Ka-25K helicopter was used to carry the remaining airframe as an underslung load. For the first time since 1942, White 51 was no longer resting in Kod Ozero. It was suspended beneath a helicopter, moving away from the water that had hidden it for more than half a century. But the lift was not flawless. According to the recovery account, chains were used in places where broad webbing would have distributed the load more gently. A chain places pressure into a much narrower area. On an airframe already weakened by damage and corrosion, that difference mattered. During the lift, the port trailing edge suffered additional damage. The aircraft had survived combat, a forced landing, and 55 years underwater. Then, during the operation intended to save it, part of the wing was damaged again. Still, the recovery succeeded in its main objective. White 51 was out. It was moved to a more convenient location where the airframe could be dismantled for transport. What now existed above ground was not a complete flying fighter, but something almost as important historically. Its wartime markings, structure, equipment, and damage could be studied directly. It was no longer only a serial number in a record or a loss remembered from wartime documents. It was a physical survivor. The next question was what to do with it. After leaving Russia, the P-40 was moved to Britain in 1998. Over the years that followed, the aircraft passed through different hands and different stages of restoration planning. The recovery had solved the most visible problem, but it had not solved the expensive and time-consuming question of what the airframe would become. For a recovered warbird, recovery and restoration are two very different tasks. Getting an aircraft out of a lake preserves the possibility of a future. Making it safe to fly requires every important part to be judged by what it can still do, not simply by whether it survived. That distinction would define the future of 41-13-57-0. By 2015, the project had reached Pioneer Aero at Ardmore in New Zealand, a specialist organization with extensive experience restoring Curtiss P-40s. There, the recovered Soviet fighter entered a much more demanding phase. The airframe was stripped into the kind of condition in which every surviving component could be assessed rather than admired from a distance. Cowl rails were repaired. Original cowling sections were laid out, checked, and separated into pieces that could be repaired, and pieces that would have to be replaced. Where original brackets could no longer do their job, new ones were fabricated. The engine installation was rebuilt around structure that had first been damaged in 1942 and then exposed to decades underwater. Work advanced through the fuselage, controls, and other systems as the aircraft gradually changed from an archaeological-looking wreck into a recognizable P-40 under construction. That progression was visible in stages. First came bare structure and individual fittings. Then repaired rails, brackets, panels, and assemblies began returning to their proper positions. As major components came together, the familiar shape of the P-40 reappeared, but much of the important work was hidden beneath the skin. The closer the aircraft came to looking complete, the less obvious the years of inspection and reconstruction beneath its surface became. Gradually, White 51 stopped looking like a recovered shell and began to look like an airplane again. The process was not simply cosmetic. A cowling panel could be repaired because its job was largely to form the aircraft's outer shape. A structural fitting or control component had a different burden. If it was going back into a flying machine, it had to perform that job safely. Some original parts could be retained. Others could not. Where surviving components were beyond use, replacements had to take their place. The restoration also required systems that no longer existed in usable form to become working aircraft systems again. Controls had to operate correctly. Engine installation hardware had to support a running power plant. Components hidden inside the airframe had to function together rather than merely make the aircraft look complete. By the time outer panels began closing the structure again, much of the difficult work was disappearing from view inside the machine. The airplane also received a dual control configuration, adding a second set of controls behind the primary cockpit. That made the restored fighter different in practical operation from the single-seat machine Pshenev had flown in 1942, but it was part of the aircraft's new operating life. There was no meaningful percentage that could describe this restoration as simply original or new. The wartime airframe and surviving components established continuity with White 51, while repairs and replacement parts made flight possible. The project had moved beyond preserving a wreck. It was rebuilding an aircraft around the material that could still serve safely. The engine illustrates that distinction clearly. During Soviet service, White 51 was recorded with an Allison V17110-39. The restored aircraft flying today uses a V710-1099. Not the wartime engine recorded with the fighter in 1942. By 2021, the long lines of the P-40 had returned. The nose, wings, cockpit, and tail once again formed a complete fighter. But visual completion was only the beginning of the final stage. An aircraft intended to fly still had to be tested, certified, and proven in operation. In May 2021, the aircraft was registered in New Zealand as ZK-MOM. Later that year, it received its certificate of airworthiness. Then, on November 11, 2021, the restored 41-13570 flew. The moment was simple compared with everything required to reach it. More than 2 decades had passed since the wreck had been lifted from Kod Ozero. The airframe had crossed countries, entered specialist workshops, been dismantled, inspected, repaired, rebuilt, fitted with systems, and prepared for testing. What had come out of the lake as a fragile wartime wreck was now moving through the air again as an operational P-40. That did not erase what had happened to the aircraft. The crash damage was part of its history. The corrosion was part of its history. So was the damage caused during the 1997 recovery. Restoration did not reverse those events. It used what survived them. New Zealand was not the end of White 51's journey. In 2022, the aircraft left the New Zealand register as preparations were made to move it to Europe. It later appeared in Belgium, initially flying under a French registration before becoming OOWHK. In 2024, the P-40 appeared publicly in the air at the Stampa fly-in in Antwerp. By then, the machine once recovered from a remote Russian lake was no longer simply a restoration project, it was a flying warbird in Europe. Yet the strongest identity the aircraft carries is still not the registration painted on it today. To understand why White 51 matters, it is better to return to the images from Kod Ozero, a battered fuselage coming out of the water, the white number still visible, a red star surviving on metal that had spent 55 years beneath a northern lake, a cockpit that could still be recognized as a cockpit, the American serial 41-13570 still linking the wreck to the fighter accepted for U.S. Army service in January 1942, and inside the wings, the remains of the weapons it had carried on the day it was lost. Those details are what separate this story from the simpler idea of a rebuilt P-40, painted to resemble a Soviet fighter. White 51 was recovered as White 51. Its wartime identity was still physically present when it came out of the lake. At the same time, the aircraft flying today should not be mistaken for a time capsule that somehow survived underwater, ready for a second life. The lake preserved enough material to make recovery worthwhile, but it also damaged the aircraft for decades. The forced landing had damaged it before it sank. The recovery operation damaged it again. Restoration then had to repair, replace, and rebuild what impact, corrosion, and time had taken away. That is the contradiction at the center of the airplane's history. In 1942, White 51 reached Lake Kod Ozero because it could no longer stay in the air. In 1997, it left the lake because a recovery team finally found a way to move a fragile fighter that had been underwater for roughly 55 years. And in 2021, after years of restoration, 41-13570 left the ground under its own power again. The most remarkable thing Kod Ozero preserved was not a complete flying machine. It preserved enough of White 51 that the aircraft could still have a future.